Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And we've done a pretty outstanding job, if I say so myself, saving the Oakland A's this year with a 64-24 record past the midway point of the season. This episode, we're going to turn our attention to hopefully helping continue to save the A's into the future. We are on the clock for the first year player draft, and the worldwide scouting department has shared their thoughts with us, and we've got some interesting decisions to make. But before we get to the draft, briefly going to talk about a couple of housekeeping items. One was a good suggestion from Scott Donovan. We've talked in previous episodes about how Jesus Saldana, although he looks like ratings-wise, he's pretty similar to the same guy that he's always been, coming out of the torn UCL that cost him most of last season and the first half of this season. But his stamina dropped off significantly. Certainly cannot really be a starter anymore for us with that 25 stamina. I guess he could, but it's not something that I want to do. And Scott Donovan brought up the point, if we put him into the closer role and he excels in that role, that can potentially make his trade value for this upcoming offseason a bit higher than it might be otherwise. And I think that's a good assessment and a good suggestion. So although Joe Heilman, the youngster, unquestionably has better stuff and throws a lot harder and is arguably a better potential closer than Saldana at this point, we're going to take him out of the role for the time being, but we're going to put him into a stopper role to hopefully ensure that we get a lot of innings out of Heilman. And with the fact that we've got a 20.5 game lead in our division at this point, and we've got a 11 game lead on Tampa Bay for the best record in the American League. And it looks like we've got a 10.5 game lead on the Mets for the best record in baseball. I think even if there's a handful of games along the way where we would have preferred to have Heilman closing things out instead of Saldana, I think it's pretty unlikely that it will ultimately have an impact on whether or not we maintain the number one seed and best record in baseball and home field advantage throughout the playoffs. And it's possible Saldana excels in that role, in which case a contract of $9 million for next year, $10 million the year after would not be excessive for a top-notch closer. But I do think it's a good suggestion that maybe makes him a bit more marketable if we do decide to move on from him this offseason. Second thing I wanted to touch upon is something that we've talked about, honestly, for a couple seasons at this point, but mostly over the last few episodes, and that's the situation at second base where neither Phil Swenson nor Amari Alcindor has really put a grip on that position with their offensive performance. But there isn't necessarily a great option in the trade market to change things. So we're going to look internally and change it. And our first baseman, Luis Godina, is actually a reasonably competent defensive second baseman. Now, we're certainly losing something in the middle infield by playing Godina at second compared to Swenson, Alcindor, or Chisin Iwata. But he certainly doesn't look like he's going to be a bad defensive second baseman. Definitely doesn't have the range of other guys that we've played there, but the bat is a huge upgrade. And what that allows us to do is to get Chris Lance into the lineup at first base against right-handed pitching, which would give us a third left-handed pitcher in the lineup. Lance has not done much this season, hitting .240 in 50 at-bats. Against right-handed pitching, though, he's been much better, putting up a 153 WRC+. He's actually 0 for 17 against left-handed pitching. So the thought is that although his numbers this year don't look much better than Alcindor or Swenson, and arguably are worse offensively than Alcindor or Swenson. Starting him every day against right-handed pitching, I guess not really every day, but platooning him against right-handed pitching will hopefully put him in the best situation possible to upgrade our offense. Now, we're definitely taking a bit of a hit at both first base and second base with this switch against right-handed pitching. But it's another move that I think allows us to hopefully ultimately improve a little bit on what this team can do this year. We haven't changed anything against left-handed pitching. Swenson's going to remain our shortstop, and we're going to pivot Iwata to second base. So ultimately, Alcindor loses his playing time against right-handed pitching. Lance gets the playing time against right-handed pitching, but we downgrade a little bit at second base, moving from Alcindor to Godina, and we downgrade a little bit at first base, moving from Godina to Lance defensively. But the hope is that the additional offense makes up for it. Still have 3 weeks to the trade deadline, too. If this ends up being a total disaster for any reason, it's not something that we won't be able to fix. Moving on to the draft, and the third thing that I wanted to speak about before I get into what the Worldwide Scouting Department has suggested and what I plan on doing. Just following up on Vernon Nelligan, a Canadian reliever that Paul West asked about. I actually didn't show him in the last episode because although he is, in terms of his current ratings, higher rated by our scout than most, I wasn't all that interested in him at the top of the draft. But he is a left-handed pitcher with some very good personality traits and profiles as a useful left-handed arm out of the bullpen. I don't love the poor competition level he's been facing as a high schooler in Canada. That being said, he's clearly been pretty dominant against that level of competition. Not someone that I think about taking in the first few rounds of the draft, since with that 25 stamina, pretty hard to make a case that he's ever going to be more than a reliever. But certainly someone that I will think about if he's still on the board when we start getting into the third, fourth, fifth rounds of this draft. Probably should have mentioned him last time around, but unlike the other pitchers that I mentioned, I just didn't see a scenario where I'd be taking Nelligan in the first couple rounds of the draft. But definitely worth mentioning. And as we talked about in the last episode, we are on the clock with the 35th pick of the first round, and we'll also be picking 2 picks from now when we get the compensatory pick for the loss of our outstanding catcher, Mr. Mendoza, as a free agent this past offseason. So 2 of the next 3 picks are going to be going to the Oakland A's, and as usual, the Worldwide Scouting Department has come through for us, and I think for the first time ever, we've had a absolute unanimous decision on what we should do. No hedging from anybody. No, this guy's good, but this guy I like just as much. The scouts who have opined all agree that the right fielder Marquis McAlpine is the way to go. Avery Shaham, Blade Staff, Paul West, Scott B., Scott Donovan, Kevin McDowell all think that McAlpine is the way to go. And he was the guy I was leaning to with my initial review yesterday at the end of the episode. Clearly have spent some more time thinking about that offline over the last couple of days, and it's hard for me to agree or to disagree with a unanimous assessment from the Worldwide Scouting Department. I think he can be above average in everything offensively with outstanding home run power, a competent corner outfielder, some good personality traits with that high adaptability and work ethic. And McAlpine is also a guy who could potentially be a two-way player. Don't see him as being a big-time pitcher, but we did talk a lot in the past episode and honestly a year ago in the draft about the dearth of high-quality pitching prospects that seem to be being produced these last couple years. Could just be an aberration, but if there just aren't good pitchers being developed, then someone like Marquis McAlpine could end up being a useful fifth starter 5 or 10 years ago if there's just not enough pitching talent in the game. So with our first pick, the 35th pick overall, we're going to be going with McAlpine. And there was also a fair amount of consistency in terms of other players that people thought might be worth considering with our second pick. The catcher, Kevin Bryan, solid defense, solid offense, was a popular pick. Center fielder, Roman Harmon, another guy who looks like he could have a pretty solid bat with decent speed, was mentioned. The young shortstop, Mel Wack, looks like one of the better defensive players with a really good personality and a bat that looks like it could be useful, was also mentioned. Another shortstop, Mike Twaddle, not quite as good defensively, but potentially outstanding home run power with a really good eye. And then the final thing to do with the second pick that was mentioned by multiple members of the Worldwide Scouting Department was potentially pivoting to one of the starting pitchers we talked about, whether it was Cullen, Corte, Eggleston, Ismailov, Jamie Lane, or Edgar Rivas. And Blade staff, Paul West, Scott Donovan, Kevin McDowell, Avery Shaham all mentioned some or all of those options for the second pick that we just talked about. So appreciate the feedback there. I think as much as I would like to bolster the pitching, I just don't really love any of these pitchers above the others. So assuming the 36th pick is not the guy that I want, my plan right now would be to go with the right fielder, Marquis McAlpine, and then the young catcher, Kevin Bryan, with the 37th pick, assuming he's not picked in the one pick before us. And then the hope would be that some of the starting pitchers that were mentioned or some of the other position players that were mentioned end up falling to us in the second, third, and fourth rounds, and we're able to round out this class nicely. Our scouting director actually recommends going with the catcher, Kevin Bryan, who we're hoping will fall to us in the 37th pick. We are going to go with McAlpine right here, though. Draft him, auto draft until our next pick, and Kevin Bryan is still available. Take a quick look at who went with that 36th pick. And it was a starting pitching prospect, Eric Pickett, not one that we were as high on, so happy to see him come off the board. And continuing the draft, as I said, we're going to go with the catcher, Kevin Bryan, with our supplemental first-round pick. I'm assuming he is still the scouting director's recommendation. He's also looking for well under slot, which helps us. Taking a look at the negotiation, and the demand for McAlpine of only $280,000 is also well below slot, so we'll get that submitted to him. So we can potentially get Bryan and McAlpine signed for about $4 million less than we had budgeted for them. And the reason why that could be potentially interesting for us this year is that we do have some extra money sitting around with the trades that we've made. And there are a couple impossible to sign players who may fall. One is the center fielder, Josh Gorna. Like the home run power, like the bat overall. And the other one that stands out is the pitcher, Tengiz Ismailov, left-handed pitcher who probably a bit overstating his value by being impossible to sign with this profile. But apparently Palm Beach Atlantic University is paying him a lot of NIL money, so he doesn't feel the need to come off of his demand, and he's going to be very difficult to sign. But either of those guys potentially could be an interesting option for us and a little more palatable to maybe bring on Ismailov or Gorna in, say, the fourth or fifth round if they're still on the board, with the fact that we've saved so much money on the first couple picks that we've made. And as we move to the second round, the three position players who, other than McAlpine and Bryan, who were mentioned by the Worldwide Scouting Department, Roman Harmon, Mike Twaddle, and Mel Wack, all still around. Fortunately for us, the pitchers are around too. Rivas, Lane, Ismailov, Eggleston, Corte, and Cullen are all still around. So got some interesting decisions to make here. I think with this second round pick, I'm kind of inclined to supplement in one of the pitchers. Just going to be a matter of figuring out exactly which one of the pitchers that is. And I've actually pivoted back with this second round pick since all of the pitchers are still around and I don't have a real strong opinion on them. I think I'm going to wait and hope that one of them falls to us in the third round. In a perfect situation, maybe a couple of them fall to us in the third or fourth round. But I'm going to go with a third player that I like the most. We've already picked up a hopefully outstanding outfielder / pitcher in McAlpine. Picked up a catcher in Bryan. And we're going to go with the shortstop, Mel Wack. Like the glove, love the personality, decent instincts on the base paths, and a potentially interesting bat for a middle infielder. The scouting director actually recommends the other shortstop, Mike Twaddle, who I'm pretty sure was mentioned by Avery Shaham. I don't know if any other of the Worldwide Scouting Department mentioned him. Twaddle certainly stands out in terms of his home run power and the really good eye. The contact and the gap power a little less special. The greed and the really poor infield error rating kind of turned me off of him. But Wack, again, definitely less home run power and a worse potential eye than Twaddle. But with the outstanding personality, I think there's a better chance that Wack will reach his full potential. Certainly prefer Wack's glove, and Wack is better in terms of his contact and gap power. So we are going to go with Mr. Mel Wack here in the second round. He's actually demanding a bit above slot, but we will just try to get him signed quickly and efficiently. And we will move on now to the third round and hope that the likes of Harmon, Twaddle, or some of the pitchers that we like might still be around. And Harmon is gone. Twaddle, the shortstop, is still around. Pitcher-wise, some are gone. Cullen and Eggleston, two guys that were certainly probably closer to the top of our list, are gone. But Corte, Ismailov, Lane, and Rivas are all still around, guys we've been looking at closely. And the reliever, Vernon Nelligan, also still in the mix. And we are going to go pitcher here. Corte has the highest ceiling, but the least interesting stuff, quite honestly. We think he's going to struggle to have major league stuff. Borderline 3-pitch arsenal if everything develops. Clearly, we could hope for some luck in the development lab. Does have high adaptability, but low intelligence. Ismailov, we may end up mixing in, but with that impossible signability, probably going to wait another round or two before potentially throwing him into the mix. So it comes down to Jamie Lane versus Edgar Rivas. Jamie Lane, a lefty. We think his stuff could be above average. Movement and control, both average. Potentially a 4-pitch arsenal, although outside of his potential changeup, none of the pitches are really borderline outstanding. Do like his durability, good stamina, outstanding at holding on runners, and like the high work ethic. He's almost 19 years old, and he's only throwing in the low 90s, though. Does have ground ball tendencies, which I like. So there's some things to like and some things not to like about Lane. And can certainly see the same thing about Rivas. He's about a year younger than Lane, and he's already throwing in the high 90s, which I really like. high adaptability and work ethic, good stamina, good at holding on runners. Only a potential 3-pitch arsenal, and he's going to be reliant on that changeup coming along. But his stuff could be borderline outstanding to go with average movement and potentially below average control. Think if either of these guys is going to develop into a true ace, there's probably going to need to be some luck in terms of the development lab and luck in general, just in terms of maximizing player development and maybe unlocking some unknown skills through mechanics by the great coaching that we have in our minor league system. But Rivas, the 17-year-old who's throwing in the high 90s with really good stamina, really good at holding on runners, might have to work on his control in the development lab, but you can't teach a guy magically to throw close to 100 miles an hour at the age of 17. Got some positive personality traits, and that stuff could definitely be special. So we're going to go with Edgar Rivas here in the third round. Coming back to the fourth, and Corte and Ismailov still around. Nelligan also on the board, but Mr. Lane is off the board now. Checking in on the batters. Gorna, the impossible to sign, is still around, but unfortunately looks like Harmon is now off the board, as well as Chwaddle. So that to me makes the decision for this fourth round a little easier. I think I'm heading back to the pitchers, but going to spend a little time offline investigating things just to make sure I'm not being too hasty in my decision making. And for those of you who like to follow around with a little more detail at home or wherever you happen to be watching, we'll just check in before we make our selection on some of the more highly regarded players that are around. Josh Gorna, we've talked about him. The bat, potentially above average in everything. Other than that, nothing inspiring as far as his defense or his speed. And he is likely to take a lot of money to sign. Ricky Fox, another center fielder, making contact and avoiding strikeouts are going to be the issues for him. But looking at that potentially outstanding gap power, home run power, and I know that profile is going to be very attractive to some of you, and certainly more attractive, I think, to some of you than it is to me. I just can't stand those guys that strike out constantly. But good speed, respectable defensively, and he does have a good work ethic, although he's not the most loyal guy in the world. Guglielmo Cesar Wilms, a third baseman with pretty good home run power. Uninspiring glove, but probably can be a functional third baseman defensively. And Mike Woodhams, first baseman, good contact hitter, pretty average at everything else offensively, not much speed, and not very special defensively. So certainly some interesting prospects to think about among this bunch. Pitching-wise, we've still got Corte. The lack of stuff has been what's kept me off of him, even though he's the highest potential pitcher out there. Don't love the greed and the low intelligence, but certainly could turn into something interesting with luck in the development lab. Tengiz Ismailov, left-handed pitcher. A lot to like about him. Looks like he could definitely be a solid major league starter. The issue with Ismailov, similar to what we've been talking about with Gorna, is that he's looking for a ridiculous amount of money to sign. Since I'm not in love with Corte, and I don't know whether or not I'd be able to get Ismailov to sign, we are actually going to pivot back to Ricky Fox. I don't love the profile that is just completely focused on home runs and walks, but he does have the potential to be so outstanding in those two aspects of the game, along with good gap power and solid speed, then I'm willing to overlook his inability to make good contact and the massive amount of strikeouts that I think he might happen, as well as some negative personality traits. Really looks like a corner outfield DH type, but with that 6'4" height, could play him at first base also. Definitely not the type of prospect I typically draft when I think about the members of the worldwide scouting department who are probably surprised to see me picking someone with this profile, and probably pleased to some degree that I'm taking someone with this profile. Avery Shayam comes to mind as someone who I think probably values home run power more than I do, and probably is a little less reluctant to take a flyer on someone who may strike out a lot and struggle to make contact than I typically am. So if you do agree with that, Avery, you've influenced me over the years, and we are going to pick Ricky Fox here with our 4th round selection. Moving on to the 5th, Gorna, the impossible to sign, still on. And Corte in the impossible to sign is Malov, also still available in the 5th round. The Canadian reliever, Mr. Nelligan, unfortunately did come off the board since our last pick. And although I don't love Dan Corte, he's had as much potential as any pitcher who's been available for us to pick in this draft since the 1st round. With some luck in the development lab, maybe adding another pitch into there, it's possible to get his stuff a bit better. We think he's going to have really good control and average movement. As a 5th rounder who's looking for almost nothing in terms of his demand and is an easy sign, I think that's a good path for us to go. If Ismailov or Gorna happens to last till the 6th round, I think it's going to be hard for me to let them go by. I'm assuming the scouting director at this point has got to recommend Corte. No, Brad Bauer, second baseman. I mean, for a 5th round selection, he's fine. But we are still going to go with the starting pitcher, Corte, here in the 5th round. So taking a look at what we've done, Ricky Fox is looking for more, but fortunately Corte is looking for less. So ultimately we've spent less on our first 6 picks, or presumably we'll spend less on our first 6 picks than we had budgeted. Pretty good mix. A couple of outfielders with McAlpine and Fox, infielder with Mel Wack, a catcher with Kevin Bryan, and with Rivas and Corte, we did end up with 2 of the top 6 starting pitching prospects that we identified in the last episode. So feel reasonably comfortable with how things have gone. And if we do anything interesting over the last 15 rounds of the draft, I'll be sure to let you know. And we won't be going for the impossible to sign Ismailov, the starting pitcher here in the 6th round, as he has come off the board. But Josh Gorna is still around, impossible to sign, but this is a guy who we think could be above average offensively in everything. Certainly if he reached his full potential, he would be a very interesting corner outfielder. He's already committed to TCU, likely to be looking for a crazy amount of money, but is a 6th round pick to bring in someone who has a higher ceiling than most of your 6th round picks. I think that's something that makes sense for us to do, even though it is bringing in a 3rd outfielder in these first 7 picks of the draft. See how much he's looking for. Bonus significantly above $11 million to consider. As I mentioned, we picked up a lot of money in trades over the last year or so. So not a decision that we're going to make immediately, but see how the rest of the draft plays out and likely see how the next few weeks of the season play out before we decide whether or not we want to make an offer to Gorna or not. Certainly have the money to bring him on board, but it's likely that bringing him on board will end up meaning that we lose money on the season unless we make it to the World Series. Clearly hope that we make it to the World Series. But you can see we're set to lose about $7 million right now before the playoffs. Incrementally, we're probably going to be spending another 7 or 8 more than we had anticipated on the draft if we try to sign Gorna, even with the money that we've saved on some of the early round selections. So that puts us into a situation where we're targeted to probably be losing $15 million or so. So unless we had a very long run through the playoffs, signing Gorna probably means we lose money this year. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, but if we lose money, it's not inconceivable that Old Man Fisher might cut back our $200 million budget, which still ranks only 28th in all of baseball. So a lot to think about, but glad to at least have the rights to Gorna to think about that decision. And in the 7th round, we're going to go for someone who's looking for a ton of money for a 7th round pick, and that's the second baseman Bobby Trout, looking for $1.4 million. But he's got a lot of positive personality traits, and he's got a bat that looks like it could be a pretty interesting bat for a middle reliever if he reaches his full potential. The glove with that 40 range is certainly not inspiring, and not great speed or bunting ability. Is a guy who could also handle a corner outfield spot in a pinch. Don't love the money that he's looking for, but similar to what we just did with selecting Mr. Gorna, I think he's the most talented and most upside player on the board, and we're at least going to bring Bobby Trout into the organization and think about trying to sign him over the next month and a half, 2 months. And as we finish up the draft, Not My Four-Ply is also opined that Marquis McAlpine was the way to go, so the unanimous decision of the Worldwide Scouting Department still stands. We're offering Trout a little less than he's looking for, just to see if maybe we can sign him for a bit less. Typically, I struggle to do that. And then with Gorna, we're going to wait and see how things go and give a little more thought to whether we maybe want to try bringing him on board in the month of August when we've got a better sense of what our financials for this season might look like. So we will now turn our attention back to the next week and a half or so of baseball till we get to the All-Star game. We've got 3 games at home against the Giants, followed by 4 in Seattle, and then 4 at San Francisco before we get to find out how many All-Stars our dominant Oakland Athletics are going to have here in 2042. And we started getting our players signed. Ricky Fox, Mel Wack, Dan Corte, Marquis McAlpine, all on board. Unfortunately, Bobby Trout, even though we were only offering him $75,000 less than he was looking for more money than that. So we'll have to decide whether or not we want to pay the full $1.4 million that he's looking for. Given that he's a pretty respectable looking prospect for a 7th round pick, and we do have extra money this year, I think I'm inclined to meet Trout's demands, but interesting that we couldn't even save $75,000 off of what he was looking for. And a little bit more mixed results for our Oakland Athletics over the last week and a half since we've got to this announcement of the All-Star teams. We did take 2 out of 3 at home against San Francisco, but then we lost a series, lost 2 out of 3 in Seattle before taking 2 out of 3 on the road at San Francisco. So as we head into the All-Star break, the Rangers have won 4 in a row. They've cut our lead in the division to 18 games at this point. The Tigers, 11 games behind us for the best record in the American League, so we are still very well positioned on that front. And the Mets at 60 and 35 are 8 games behind us for the best record in baseball, despite winning 5 in a row and a 9-1 record in their last 10. The youngster, the rookie DH, Juan Ramirez, is now third in the American League in home runs. You may remember we signed him to I think, hopefully very cost-effective extension before the season got underway. Luis Godina and Arturo Uresti are second and third in the American League in ribbies. Godina is also third in OPS. Jonah Richards, the outstanding young catcher, leading the American League in batter WAR. And Federico Arriola, last year's American League Cy Young Award winner, who ended that streak of 7 consecutive Cy Young Awards by Steve Genis, who's now out with elbow tendonitis for 4 to 5 weeks. Arriola doing his best to position himself to become a repeat Cy Young Award winner. Second in the league in wins, tied for second with our old buddy, the knuckleballer, Andres Rojas of the Yankees, but leading the league in ERA, tied for the league lead in pitcher WAR. And Joe Heilman leading the league in saves, despite moving into that stopper role for us more recently. Before we finish off the episode, we'll take a look at the Prospects game roster and the All-Star game roster. The Prospects game, as we've seen a lot in recent years, dominated by Oakland Athletics young pitchers. I think this is similar to last season, but no Oakland position players on the All-Star Prospects game roster, but a ridiculous 5 Oakland pitchers on the pitching staff for the American League. David Ibarra, who's been up with us in the majors this year and gotten caught in a numbers game, only has a 4.31 ERA in AAA, but does have 18 saves, and certainly his outstanding fastball and his ridiculous stuff got the attention of those who select for these games. Roque de la Paz, who we recently promoted from the Arizona League to Single A, done a solid job at both levels with a combined 12 saves, and still think the young left-hander, who's the number 67 prospect in baseball, could be a very important part of our bullpen in the future. Jesus Berlanga, another closer. He's doing it for us in Double-A this year, where he's got 21 saves. The 4.45 ERA, not all that great, but he is striking out 12.5 batters per 9 innings. Another guy with an excellent fastball and really interesting stuff. And then the last two are a couple guys who are closer to the majors. Ronnie Dehan, a 22-year-old former 8th-round draft pick, left-handed pitcher who's put up a 4.22 ERA in 17 relief appearances in Las Vegas. And then last, but certainly not least, Luis Villarreal, who we, of course, if you've been following us closely, signed to that 10-year, $68 million contract earlier this season when he was in Double-A ball. Recently promoted to Triple-A, where he's 1-1 with a 3.57 ERA, but he has struck out 144 batters this year between the two levels and is considered the number 9 prospect in baseball. Certainly would not be surprised to see Luis Villarreal joining us just about 5.5, 6 weeks when we get to September roster expansion. So a nice crop of strong young relievers from Oakland playing in the All-Star Prospects game this year. As far as the actual All-Star game, no surprise to see Federico Arriola get his second All-Star nod. Made it last year and makes it again this year. And as we talked about, he's making a strong case to be a repeat Cy Young Award winner for us. We always seem to have a couple of random bullpen arms who make the All-Star team. This year, Kevin Carmichael gets his first All-Star appearance. Picked him up in a trade with Toronto almost 4 years ago. Has become a good, solid reliever for us and has a 2 ERA for us with 40 strikeouts and 36 innings working out of the bullpen this year. And Jonathan Shearer, also a first-time All-Star, the 28-year-old former 15th round pick 11 years ago out of high school that's developed very well in our farm system. 2.96 ERA over 45 and 2/3 innings with a scintillating 64 strikeouts, 12.6 strikeouts per 9 for Mr. Shearer. So 3 Oakland Athletics on your American League pitching staff for the All-Star game. Not surprisingly, Jonah Richards, who was snubbed for the All-Star game a year ago despite winning Rookie of the Year, is a first-time All-Star this season. We talked about him earlier, leading the American League in WAR and having a really outstanding offensive season for us. 319 average, 16 homers and 50 ribbies, 165 WRC plus. Obviously in the lineup a bit less this year than he was last year when he was primarily our DH, but adding a ton of value with his excellent defense behind the plate. Already has put up a higher WAR this year than he did all of last season. Certainly his better offense is helping that a bit, but the defense, I'm sure, is helping as well. Luis Godina, who we recently moved from first base to second base, at least against right-handed pitching, having a monster season. 314 average, 23 homers and 83 ribbies at the All-Star break. Also his 23 doubles and 7 triples, 162 WRC plus and a 3.6 WAR for the now 2-time All-Star Mr. Godina. And that is it for the All-Stars for our Oakland A's. Some somewhat familiar names in Juan Pimentel, the third baseman. Our corner outfielders, Darnell Selvey and Arturo Uresti, not given the honor of playing in the Midsummer Classic this year, but still a solid representation for our Oakland Athletics with 5 All-Stars this year. Looking at the National League, the incredible Andy Grimes with his 90 stuff and his brilliant 5-pitch arsenal, having what you would call a down year for him as he tries to win a 3rd consecutive Cy Young Award. 7-5 with a 2.73 ERA. Still has put up a 5.8 WAR on the season, though, so not surprising to see him on the All-Star team. Mike Ramsey, Atlanta's brilliant two-way player, 11-3 with a 3.29 ERA as he tries to add to his collection of 4 Cy Young Awards and 6 Most Valuable Player Awards. Batting-wise, still continues to trend in a not incredible direction, although he has actually improved from last year, a 116 WRC plus this season at the plate, up from 108 a year ago. So Sirique remains a very productive player as well. And with that, we will call it an episode. Next time around, we will think more deeply about what we want to do potentially ahead of the trade deadline. Saldana has lowered his ERA to 3.94 since moving to the bullpen. Also has picked up a couple of saves, so hopefully he's improving his value a bit there. Heilman, as we talked about, still leading the league in saves for the time being, despite being moved out of the closer role. Lineup-wise, Chris Lance, unfortunately, in a cold streak. The batting average has dropped to 222. So the move of getting him some more at-bats, not working out incredibly well. His performance against right-handed pitchers has definitely slipped since we started giving him regular playing time. So we'll continue to investigate whether or not there is anything for us to do in the trade market. Interesting name recently added, not going to necessarily solve our problem at second base, but certainly would give us a big time bat at first base if we wanted to keep Godina at second, and that's Galterio Mancina, who's now with the Colorado Rockies after Kansas City traded him there almost a year ago. This is a player that I believe we looked at, I think it might have been in the first IAFA signing period. If not, it was one of the very early ones, and we were very intrigued by, went in a different direction, and he'd become a big-time player. Yeah, it was the first IAFA period back in 2025 where we were interested in Mancina's bat, and he's definitely become a big-time player in the final year of that monster contract with the Rockies. I'm assuming it will take a lot to bring a guy like him on board. Got some options, though. Definitely something for us to think about. You know, you think about Carmichael, the all-star. He's done a really good job for us over the years as a left-handed reliever. But he's also a guy who's going to be making $6 million next year in arbitration. And as we talked about, we've got a ton of talent at AAA, several of whom were in the All-Star Prospects game or will be in the All-Star Prospects game, as well as 2 or 3 other guys who weren't in the All-Star Prospects game who are arguably as good as some of the guys at AAA who were. So to me, that stands out as a guy we could potentially look to bring on Galterio Mancina and just give ourselves another monster bat if we decide that Lance is not the answer at first base and we're willing to consider a little bit weaker glove with Godina becoming our everyday second baseman. Bringing on a guy like Galterio Mancina would certainly be a win-now type move for this win-now team of ours to try to make. The big issue, of course, is going to be how much of that contract we could get them to retain. You know, I don't think we're going to make a deal right now, but we'll just see. Yeah, they'd keep 30% of his contract, which would mean that we'd have to spend about $7.5 million extra dollars this year, which certainly isn't going to help our ability to turn a profit. But by the same token, as much as Mr. Fisher cares about profits, bringing Mancina on board would certainly give us a much more impressive offense as we try to win it all this year. A lot of our former players on the trade block at this point too. Jaden Boakai, Andy Toribio, Sergio Palomares, Alejandro Landin, Byron Brain. Landin out with a fractured thumb for 7 weeks, or we could potentially look to reunite with him. I want to say, is Landin the guy that we went in that first IAFA? No, I think he's too young for that. I thought he might have been the guy that we picked over Mancina, but he was the 2027 IAFA period. Well, while I'm looking at the trade block, not that we need a lot of help as far as our pitching, but there are certainly some more interesting players on the market now. Our old farmhand Joe Lewin, our old stopper Mike Orozco, Mike Curtis, who was with us at one point, certainly with Ishmael Carrera, Jorge Bernal, and Cole Lawrence. Certainly some interesting starting pitchers and closers available. So it's going to be an interesting decision for us. We've got money to spend this year, if we don't mind, as I said, losing money for Mr. Fisher and perhaps putting ourselves in a position where our budget gets cut back next year. But it would certainly be interesting to win this year, which would put us in a position where we would have 4 of the last 7 World Series championships, despite never repeating, if we're able to win this year, which I'm pretty confident has never been done in the history of baseball. So we will spend some time offline thinking about what, if anything, we should consider doing in the trade market. If you've got any thoughts, it's always helpful to hear those as well. Until our next episode, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.